So we're going to look at the wheat harvest in the Bible, right? Right now is when we're going through across the U.S. The wheat harvest is on, and it started out a little earlier down south in Texas, and we'll move up through the Great Plains, through Kansas, Nebraska, into British Columbia, Canada, and up there as far up as they can plant it. And wheat's a good crop for up north. We're going to go through some of that. So what does the Bible have to say about the wheat harvest? Let me see here. Let's move on. Well, here, I'm sharing the screen, but get me off of here and let's go. Oh, what in the world? Let's try a button. There we go. We had to toggle. They just wanted to keep running that little thing all the time here. Let me get rid of these floater controls. Boom. Here we go. So to start off with, we got to lay some groundwork. What's the big deal with the wheat harvest? So remember that the Moedim, all of the appointed feast days, revolve around an agricultural timeline, whether it's to set off the beginning of the year with the barley harvest and the maturity of the barley. Remember, the Abib is what we want to do. It's from almost ready to harvest, where you could harvest it, but you'd have to dry it out a little bit, cook it, parch it to get it to be usable, to fully ripe and harvest ready. That's in the spring of the year. Then we go on to Shavuot with the wheat harvest, which in our area, the Shavuot was about a month ago, a little bit more than a month ago. So it doesn't quite line up here, but when you figure what's going on in Jerusalem, it lines up about right. So it's part of the wheat harvest there. You get into the fall where the grape harvest, the olives, the apples, the fruit orchards, everything else, the full season crops come in the fall festivals. And that's where we have the big end gathering. That's where tabernacles, we get it in and we bring our tithes, we bring the fruit of our land, we bring it all in, and we have a festival. So that's what's going on. The Corban, all of that. If you haven't reviewed my teaching on all of the Leviticus 1, 2, 3, the Levitical sacrifices, they all revolve around an agricultural theme, and it's all about producing food for the ones who are working the temple. And the Levite and the priesthood didn't have a part in the inheritance of the land, but everybody in the land that did take part in that inheritance were to bring in tithes and offerings, so that the priests, the Levites, the people that work around God's ministry, if you will, are taken care of. They didn't have to worry about all of that. So that's kind of what it says. So let's look into these harvests. Matthew 9:35. Then Jesus went around the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered, like sheep having no shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." And I did a post when we were out in the combine. I'll show you some of those pictures at the end of the presentation, while we were going through the fields. And this verse came to mind as we were going through that. Truly, the harvest is ready. And so many people, Prophet Darren talked about it this morning, I imagine Prophet Steve will touch on it. There seems to be a thing that each of us go a little bit different direction, but same themes about how we're truly at a point in time where people need the true gospel. They don't need a religion. They need the good news of the full gospel, the full Torah message of salvation. And I want to look here. We'll take a look at Numbers 27 here real quick. Then Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, let the Lord God of the spirits of all flesh set a man over the congregation who may go out before them and go in before them, who may lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep which have no shepherds. Well, what does sheep and shepherds have to do with the wheat harvest? It's all about bringing in that harvest, bringing in that kingdom principle of the harvest. And here, so many times we forget that there are so many bad shepherds out there, that we want to make sure that we're teaching properly, that we're imparting wisdom from the Spirit, not from the flesh. And I hope, and I know most of us, all of us, endeavor to do that through prayer, through fasting, through meditation in the Word. Here's a few harvest references in Scripture. Exodus 34:22, and thou shalt observe the feast of weeks of the fruits of the wheat harvest, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year. The feast of weeks and the first fruits is, of course, in the spring. That's part of the whole unleavened bread. The wheat harvest is the Passover, the Pesach. I'm getting tongue tangled here. No, Pentecost. Pentecost, Shavuot, is the wheat harvest timeline. And the ingathering at the year's end is then Sukkot, that area there. Numbers 18:12, all of the best of the oil and all the best of the wine and of the wheat, the first fruits of them, which they shall offer unto the Lord, them have I given thee. And this is talking about the tithes and offerings going to the priesthood and the Levites, right? Deuteronomy 8:8, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. He was talking there about our promised land in Jerusalem and that surrounding area. Luke 22:31, and the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has desired to have you that he may sift you as wheat. And I've got a picture that kind of shows that'll bring a little bit more to light on that. John 12:24, verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat or a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone, but if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. Now, when you look at these heads over here, either in back of me or to the right of the screen, you'll see that each one of those stalks was one kernel of wheat, one grain. But yet, if you can count all of those little partitions in there, you can see that one kernel may produce 50, 60, 100. That's when we're talking about the reference in scriptures where the harvest may go 30, 60, and 100 fold. And that's what we're talking about there. For those of you that haven't been in the agricultural area, that's kind of why I'm doing this. We have a lot of preachers out there that make reference and they talk about thrust in your sickle and everything else, and haven't got a clue and never stepped into a wheat field, much less actually having done anything like that. So this is from an old farm boy, and I know there's at least one other old farm boy listening, maybe more, that understand and can do this some justice. and educate the rest of you, maybe some things you didn't know. Here's a few more references. Samuel 1:12, is not the wheat harvest today? I will call the Lord, and he shall send thunder and rain, that you may perceive it and see your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord in asking you a king. And here, this gives us an idea what time of the year this was. It was in that midsummer, the wheat harvest area. And the thing that most people overlook or don't understand is that when the grain is fully ripe, like it is right there, if a hailstorm comes in, if a big thunderstorm comes in, it can knock the heads off, it can lay the wheat down. If it lays it down flat enough, then it will start to spoil and you'll lose the whole crop. Or if it rains and it does that, it loses value, the test weight, we call it. We're shooting for 60 pounds of the bushel. Every time when it's ready, it needs to be harvested immediately, because every rain that comes, and few know this, after it's ready, when it reaches that peak, when it gets its moisture down to that 12 to 13%, so it stores right and doesn't mold, then it loses test weight. And it will lose test weight down to a point from 60, maybe down under 50 pounds per bushel. When it gets that, it's just a husk. All of the starches inside the kernel will disappear, if you will. And it's nothing more than the husk, the germ that's out there. It's all fiber. So what makes the wheat valuable is the starch that's inside the kernel. And that's what makes our bread taste good. And that's what the yeast works on to make it rise. Kings 15:11, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 measures of wheat for food for his household, and 20,000 measures of pure oil. Thus gave Solomon to Hiram year by year. Now, this was a wage. They used wheat as we use dollar bills. They traded. It was a commodity. This is what they made their bread out of. And now you'll see at the very end here, we're doing some experiments with an ancient variety of wheat that we're trying to bring back. And I'm thinking that Prophet Steve, if he's listening, will find this pretty interesting and may have just grown some of this particular cultivar. So that's what we're doing. It's a commodity. It's a food source. It's a barter issue. Psalms 81:16, he should have fed them also the finest of wheat, and with honey out of the rock should I satisfy thee. And scripture also talks a lot about bread. Well, what are you going to make your bread out of? Yeah, I know you could do the Ezekiel bread where he talked about using the wheat and the lentils and the beans and everything else together. And that's real good. We've made and had Ezekiel bread before. I particularly like it, but it is pretty high in carbohydrates, but it's also got a lot of vitamins and nutrition in it. Psalms 147:14, he maketh peace in thy borders and filleth thee with the finest of wheat. So there must be, with all the references to wheat in the scriptures like this, there must be some significance to it. Interesting things about wheat for those of you that don't know much about it. It's planted in the fall. In most cases around here, we use a hard red winter wheat. Now, other places will plant durum wheat. Some places will plant a spring wheat. Some will plant a soft red winter wheat. Some will have a white wheat. There's a bunch of different kinds. We'll look into that a little bit. Summer harvest for all of those types of wheat. It's a higher value crop than rye or barley. We also just got done taking off our rye crop, and we use that as well. Different ways of doing it. Rye is not as good because it doesn't doesn't have as much starch in the seed itself, so it's not as good, but you can't hardly beat a good rye bread too. Barley has just got so much covenant that it takes so much more to shell that out, that that's the poor man's. But the barley in the biblical times was the first to mature, and that's why they used it. Wheat is a more versatile crop. You can make breads, you can make cakes, you can make pastas, you can do a lot of things. Bulgur, you can swell them up, let them sprout, dry them out, and use it for a sugar, a malt, if you will. And when you use that malt in your breads, it gives it a unique flavor. It stores easily when you get it down to the right moisture. It does store, but it's easy to get insects, and it's real prone to get weevils in it and millbugs and things like that. So you got to watch how you store it too, because the bugs really like it. It's considered an ancient grain. It's been around for 10,000 plus years. It was that people started to use it for food. Consumed worldwide, like rice, wheat is consumed worldwide. Wheat 101, here you go, almost 10,000 years. Today, farmers grow about 50 million acres of wheat in the US alone, not to mention Canada. You talk about Russia and Ukraine. Those are all big spots for raising wheat. Wheat by the numbers, you can look there if you want to do that. A modern combine can harvest 1,000 bushels an hour. Well, my little combine takes a few more hours to do it, but still much better than going out there with the old sickle making the shocks and bringing them in like that to the harvest equipment, which they have to do. 100 years ago, that was the way they did it. And beyond that, in the Bible times, they had to put it down and mill it out and beat it out by walking across it with oxen and different things like that to kind of get the heads out. So you can see it is an important staple for food around the world. Now, here's some of the classes of wheat that you can look. You can go back, find the video, and look through these if you want to do it. The durum wheat is real hard. That's the one that makes the pastas. This is the one, the hard red winter wheat is the one that we usually grow here in Southwest Michigan. Prophetic verses about wheat. Jeremiah 12:13, they have sown wheat, but shall reap thorns. They have put themselves to pain, but shall not profit. And they shall be ashamed of your revenues because of the fierce anger of the Lord. When you have a failure in your wheat harvest crop, famine is right at the door. It was a staple, the bread. You think about in the Bible, they didn't have the refrigeration. They couldn't do the things. They made bread constantly, all day, every day, to have something to eat. They just didn't go down to Walmart and grab a couple of loaves off the shelf, right? Jeremiah 31:12, therefore they shall come and sing in the heights of Zion, and shall flow together of the goodness of the Lord for wheat and for wine and for oil and for the young of the flock and of their herd, and their soul shall be as watered garden, and they shall not sorrow anymore at all. Interesting how wheat and wine and the oil are staples, not only in the temple worship system. Every time you would bring in a meat offering or a sacrificial animal, whether it be a lamb or a bullock or dove or whatever, you would bring those in, but you would also have what they called the meat offering, which was wheat. You would bring in flour, you would bring in oil so that they could cook it, usually in olive oil, and then you would bring in wine so that all of those crops, when you think about it, the wheat harvest in the summer and the fall harvest around the fall Moedim, the Sukkot time, all go together. Now, Joel 2:24, and the floor shall be full of wheat, and the vats shall overflow with wine and oil. He's talking about in the latter days when the millennial kingdom is set up. The floors, the threshing floors at that time, so what they knew, in our case, the grain bins, the silos will be full of wheat. Matthew 3:12, whose fan is in his hand. Now they had to winnow it. They had to have a fan that blew the chaff away. Again, I got a picture that'll help you out with that. And he will thoroughly purge his floor and gather his wheat into the garner or the grain bin or the storage facility, but he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. The chaff, in that case, we use the chaff for bedding for the livestock, but it's trampled down. They do the number 1 and number 2 on it to keep them dry and up out of their own stuff, you know. But in this case, the Lord will burn it up as useless. Matthew 13:30, let both grow together until the harvest, and the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, gather ye together first the tares and bind them into bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Today's modern combines and that separate that out as we harvest. And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you that he may sift you as wheat. John 12, verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. So it's got to go into the ground. You've got to plant it to bring a harvest. And there he was talking, that was Yeshua talking about his life. As long as he was there, he could do so much. But when he crossed over and was put into that grave, into that tomb, then he could actually do exponentially greater works. Revelation 6:6, and I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 beasts say, a measure of wheat for a penny and 3 measures of barley for a penny. See thou hurt not the oil and the wine. There we go again, another reference with all 3 of those, now 4 with the barley as well, talking about some famine, some hard times coming. Whoop, back up here. Revelation 14. Then I looked, and there was a white cloud sitting on the cloud like a son of man, who had a gold crown and on his head a gold crown on his head. Let me start over. And a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out from the sanctuary, crying in a loud voice to the one who was sitting on the cloud, you must now send your sickle. You must now reap, because the time to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth has withered. Now, if you're looking at in back of me here, this wheat is a bearded wheat, what we call it. It's got the awns, that's the little beards that are coming off the wheat. When that comes in and those heads tip, and it's not green and it's withered and it's dried out, that's when we know. And then we take some of that wheat and we shell it out, and we make sure that the moisture is down just where we want it so it'll store. If we harvest too soon, it won't be ripe enough and it will spoil. If we harvest too late, then a lot of it will be knocked out of the heads at harvest and just be lost on the ground. So here, and I think the timing of this is at that millennial, when we're going through at the first resurrection and Yeshua's come back to set up his kingdom. That's when that harvest is going to begin to culminate. If you can look, that this would make sense to do this, to set this in motion for that harvest right before Yeshua returns at the Feast of Trumpets in the fall Moedim, setting up the Day of Atonement, the cleansing of the temple, the cleansing of the earth from sin, the incarceration of the evil, and set it up so that God again can take over the earth and occupy for 1,000 years. It's a great setup, and you would miss it if you didn't know about how these different crops come into it. Now, let's look here. Now we can get on. There's the old International. No, it's not a big dude, but this was harvested this week. This was us running and going right at it. And, from what I had before, that was a great thing. So now here we talk about the chaff, right? You can see here where I picked some of this, and now this is an experimental plot that we've got coming in. When I got home, they told me last year, hey, we've got some red fife, and I had to look at it, see what was going on. So we planted a little section here. We didn't have a lot of seed. We had to order it from Canada, and this is where I say Prophet Steve may know a little bit about this particular crop, and maybe not. I mean, it was more of a Western crop, but he may have known it, but it's a very particular wheat. It's not the modern cultivars and hybrids that we have. The nice thing about wheat, too, is that Monsanto and the rest of the boys have not messed around with genetically modifying wheat. They can't make enough money on it because usually it's harvested and it covers up when it grows in the spring and gets going. It shades the other weeds, so you don't get a lot of weeds in the wheat. You can, but the amount of people that would spray Roundup Ready wheat are very few. So this particular variety, Triticum aestivium, is a Canadian cultivar, okay? And you can see what's going there. It's a bread wheat. And we're going to try this. We're going to keep a majority of this and plant a larger section. And I want to try to grind some up. We want to try maybe to make some bread out of it and that. And here's why. Here's some origins of this wheat. And I find it funny that red fife is Canada's oldest wheat. I want to get back to some of the ancient grains. I want to get back to some of the grains that don't have all the genetic modifications. It's a more pure strain, and that's kind of what we're doing here. It's told here that a load of wheat grown in the Ukraine was on a ship, and a friend of Farmer Fife dropped his hat into the red-colored wheat, collecting a few seeds in the hat band, which then he shipped off to Farmer Fife. The wheat grew, and the family cow managed to eat all the wheat heads except for one, which Mrs. Fife, bless her heart, salvaged. This was the beginning of the red fife wheat in Canada. You can see how that from one stalk, one of these little guys up here that you can see like that was enough to start planting, start growing. And I'm sure they protected it from the family cow a little better. And then you can see here where it's got more and more popular, and it was replaced. But there's a bunch of people in Canada and around the world that in fact want to go back to the red fife because it's full aroma, golden reddish color on the crust. It's gaining popularity again through artisan bakers. And I'm kind of curious to try it. It's got more protein and it's got less of some of the things that cause problems when people take wheat, the gluten, there we go. It's got some different ratios with the gluten, so it's a little friendlier to people with dietary restrictions. So we're gonna give it a shot and see where we go there. But that's kind of what was going on for those of you that didn't know. And I want to go back up here 1 second. Now, when you look here, I picked one of these heads of this red fife and I kind of shelled out just like this in my hand, one of those heads, and this is what I'm left. Now, all of this is the husk that's on, as you can see here, and you can see a little better some of these up close. This is the chaff. This is what we're talking about when and I'll separate the wheat from the chaff. These are the berries, the wheat berries that we're looking for. That's the good stuff. That's what we're making our bread and flour and meal out of. And what I did here, and I didn't record it as a video, but here I just took and blew a little bit, and all of this chaff, as you can see in my fingers up here, kind of blew away and separated and just left the wheat. And that's what the Father's talking about. He's going to separate all of this. He's going to separate the chaff from the wheat, and this will go in. That's the biblical reference that we've got there. So now you know, now you've seen it firsthand, no pun intended. And I'm gonna escape. There we go. So everything you want to know about wheat and we're afraid to ask in one little setting. It's good to understand some of these things and understand why the Bible is doing, because so much of us are removed from the agricultural setting that the Bible, especially the Torah, the Old Testament, is based on. And you can miss some of the nuances if you don't understand what's going on. So there you have it. For those of you that want more information, feel free to get a hold of the ministry. I'd be glad to answer anything there. But understand there's some of us that are getting back to a more natural approach, a more natural. I didn't say anything about the mung beans that were growing out there and the different things there. They're getting away from the genetically modified food sources and setting up something that's a lot more healthy. Amen. So let's go ahead and go to prayer. Like I said, this was going to be light, and there you got it.